Welcome to the More Time, More Money and More Wealth mini podcast for medical professionals, brought to you by MediSuccess and the WOW Advisors Group. This podcast is dedicated to medical professionals who would like to work smarter, not harder, earn significantly more income and create astonishing wealth. Now, let me introduce you to our host today, Hitesh Mohanlal.
Hello and welcome to podcast 8 of How to Work Less, Earn More and Create Unbelievable Wealth for Medical Professionals. What do I want to talk about today? Well, I thought we'll talk about taxes because every medical professional that I know always wants to pay less tax. In fact, I've written a tax guide on it because so many people ask me, how can we pay less tax? How can we pay less tax? So I actually wrote a tax guide. So if you do want a copy, please let us know and we will get a copy over to you. But it's asked a lot. You know, we go to conferences quite a lot, a few medical conferences, and the first question is, how do I pay less tax? And there's this obsession with paying taxes. And what I'm going to say to you is be careful, okay? Because we all pay it. I pay it. My team pays it. The checkout guy at Woolies pays it. The difference is that when you see your tax bill, you see a whopping great big figure. And often you have to pay large lump sums, okay? Whereas the guy at the checkout till, he pays tax quite a lot considering his income or her income, but they don't see it because it's taken out every week and they just deal with what pay they have, all right? In your case, big, huge figure, big problem, okay? And what I'm going to say to you is what I have found is that medical professionals specifically kind of misunderstand that high income, high taxes, and wealth are in different parts, and you got to understand each part, okay? So high income, don't assume high income is going to equal wealth, okay? It doesn't, all right? Okay, high income is potential wealth. It depends what you do with that income, which will determine whether you become wealthy or not. And this is what I'm going to say to you. The ATO recently published the top income earners, okay? The top 10 income earners, and 5 of those were specialist medical professionals, okay? The top 5 included, I think, 3 medical professionals. So in the whole of top 10, you got 5 medical professionals there, and that's fantastic. Then on the other side, if I created a list of the top 10 wealth generators, I'll be surprised if a single medical professional makes it there, okay? Now, that does not mean that you don't have wealth. Of course, you do have wealth, but considering your income capacity, you should have significantly more wealth, okay? And the question then becomes is, why? Why is it that medical professionals don't have as much wealth as they probably should, okay? And I'm going to go back. It's because you're concentrating on taxes, all right? And sometimes what happens is when you go to an accountant and says, I want to pay less tax, give me a strategy to pay less tax, that's what they're going to come up to me. So when I get a lot of medical professionals who come in and ask me and says, I want to pay less tax, make me pay less tax. And I would just say, work less. If you work less, you earn less. If you earn less, you pay less taxes. And they said, no, but that's not what I want. And I'm saying, yes. But you asked a very specific question and I gave you a specific answer. What you really want is you want either to work less but have the same income, or you want the same income and you want wealth but you don't want to pay as much tax. And that's a different question, okay? So what I often say to a client is, what is it you want, okay? If you want more income, how do we get that more income but pay less tax? Or the best way of strategizing it so that the least amount of tax is paid on that income. Okay. It might still mean that overall you pay more tax than you did last year, but your income's higher. So therefore it makes sense. Okay. Equally, if you want to build wealth, the way we want to build wealth is how do we get to that wealth? Doesn't mean we're not going to pay less tax or no tax. All it means is how do we get there with a strategy that allows you to pay the least amount of taxes. And that's a different strategy and scenario, okay? And what sometimes happens is when we go down the rabbit hole of tax, reduce tax, reduce tax, reduce tax, you can come out with a completely end result that you had not thought you were going to end up with. And I'll give you an example. Okay, we did a conference last year, and out of one of those leads, we got someone who gave us a call, and they said, "Look, I'm thinking of retiring, but I don't think I can." And I said, "Well, what gives you that impression?" He goes, "Well, because I've created a portfolio of properties, but I'm not convinced I can retire." And then we got into a bit more of a conversation. And it turns out he has 21 properties. And I'm thinking to myself, well, if you've got 21 properties and you've paid off a fair chunk of the loans on that, I can't understand why you can't retire. Send me all your information and let me have a look. All right. Now, what his accountant had done was he put everything, all these properties were in the sole name of this medical professional. Okay. Now, apart from a protection issue, because I don't think those assets would be protected, there are other issues. So the reason the accountant did that was because this client wanted to pay less tax, and the accountant said, well, let's do negative gearing, okay? And if you do negative gearing, you'll pay less tax. In fact, you might even get huge tax benefits out of it, okay? And he went down the rabbit hole of reduced taxes. Now, the problem was because all these properties were in his own name, the land tax bill starts getting out of control. When you got 21 properties, you were going to have a whopping great big land tax bill. Okay. The second thing that came out of that was some of the loans were paid off, but there were still big chunks of loans that were still outstanding. And the incomes were not, the income from these properties were not enough to pay the land tax bill and not enough to pay the loan. Okay, so we were in this scenario where he says, I want to retire, I've had enough, I don't really want to work. And I had to say to him, yeah, you can't retire, because if you retire, your income's going to go down, and some of that income is required to pay off the land tax and some of the loans on the properties. So in order to solve that, you're going to have to sell some of the properties. But if you sell some of the properties, you've now got capital gains tax at the highest tax rate because they're all in your name. Okay. And we came back and we did some calculations, and he said, nah, I'm not doing that. It's just too much tax. What I'm going to do is I'm going to work for another 5 or 10 years, pay off the house loans as much as I can, and I'll just have to deal with the land tax. Okay. So by doing that, so having a strategy of paying less tax has actually resulted in having to work an extra 5 or 10 years that he doesn't actually want to work. Okay. And that's a classic strategy where the objective was not looked at. The objective should have been, how do I create wealth? How do I reduce my working hour time when I don't want to work? Rather than, I want to pay less tax. Okay. So when you speak to your advisors, when you sit down with your accountant, don't just think reduce tax, reduce tax, reduce tax. Ask yourself, what is it that I want? I want to retire at 55. I want to retire at 60. Do I want the hassle of having properties and dealing with agents and all of that sort of stuff? What is it you really want? Then what you do is you come up with a plan and you say, right, I want this by this time. How do I now get that but pay the least amount of tax, but I must have that, okay? Because if you go down the rabbit hole of, I just want to pay less tax, it actually means we have to reduce income in order to get the less tax legally. All right. I hope that was useful. Thank you very, very much. Thank you for listening.